Okay, so I think we've been pretty on time so far, and I don't want to hold us back. We have quite a full program today as well, so I think this is time to begin. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Carole Cusack, who will present our third keynote address of the conference. She is at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Sydney. She is one of the most prominent and active figures in contemporary Gurdjieff scholarship. A prolific author herself, she is also engaged in editing a series of volumes and a number of journals in the wider field. Trained as a medievalist, she has subsequently diversified into the areas of contemporary religious trends and Western esotericism. In addition to her other activities, she has organized various conferences, including the extremely successful event held at Harvard last December. Anahid and I also appreciate her insightful input at various points in the process of organizing this conference. The topic of her address today is Gurdjieff and Modernity, Science Fiction as a Work Textual Technique. After her presentation, the speaker has graciously agreed to entertain questions. So, without more ado,
good morning. Thank you very much for attending this conference and for coming to my keynote. I wanted to draw attention at the beginning to the Harvard conference last year and to thank Peter and Anahit for introducing themselves not only to me, but to the assembled hordes at the conference and making a lot of new friends and connections in the field of work studies and having brought about this amazing gathering. And it's so exciting to be here with so many of my fellow speakers from Harvard last December. It's a reunion, as the Americans say, old home week. Now, the work that I do is, I try to say, non-controversial, and I often think that people imagine that it's somewhere moving around the edge of Gurdjieff studies. This is partly because I am not in the work, and that is something that I'm perfectly okay with people knowing, and I understand that it means that there are areas that are, if not off limits, certainly sensitive. So one of the things that I would say is my strength is I work a lot on cultural productions that have come out of Gurdjieff's esoteric system and the innovations and continuations of his pupils and their pupils right up to the present day. And so today I want to talk about science fiction. And the basic contention of this lecture is that even if you regard Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson as a work of scripture, a philosophical treatise, a cosmological text which explains the place of humanity in reality, in frame, it is a science fiction novel. And that has to mean something. Science fiction is a modern, post-industrial revolution literary form, and it does connect with the ways that we think of Gurdjieff as perhaps a modern, anti-modern, traditional, etc. kind of figure. And I guess my contention today is going to be that he is a modern and has an awareness of, an embeddedness in traditional cultures, but nevertheless is certainly no naive, exotic, primitivist healer turning up in the West, peddling a certain kind of Eastern, quote marks, wisdom. So Gurdjieff's often presented as anti-modern. He had a reputed disdain for modern art, classical music, um, literary forms in some cases. He's certainly recorded as stating that they were valueless or saying nothing of substance about the world. Similarly, he was interested in peasant remedies for certain medical conditions and sometimes expressed atavistic attitudes. And so we have this idea that some people put him forward as an anti-modern. But I think this is an erroneous idea. It's not just that he uses modern forms in his textual productions. He is also pretty clearly a very well-educated man. And if you mine the sources that pupils left about him, some of the quality of that education and the specialist areas that it involves become basically apparent. The other thing that's interesting is that all the pupils that he attracted in the original Russian period, but also after leaving Russia in 1917 and then settling later in Paris, the pupils that he attracted were experts in their fields, and they were people whose expertise seems to have been something that Gurdjieff appreciated and in many ways made use of, which is an important thing to think about. So what I wanted to talk about today is this relationship of Gurdjieff and his teachings to some traditional ideas, but to reclaim basically his status as a thinker and a teacher of modern esotericism, a system, in fact, that doesn't, some people are worried about the term system, maybe I shouldn't have used it, a teaching that actually doesn't appear to have many clear antecedents, unlike, for example, the Theosophy of Helena Blavatsky, which was mentioned briefly yesterday, and a teaching that translates very well to 20th century modernity. So we have the modern educated pupils. When Gurdjieff collected pupils in Russia, the most obvious is the formidable autodidact Pyotr Demyanovich Uspensky, who was, novelist, philosopher, thinker, interpreter of Gurdjieff's ideas, amateur mathematician, collector of traditions and information about the spiritual cultures of the world. Truly interesting man. But other pupils included Thomas de Hartmann, the Ukrainian classical composer, his aristocratic opera singer wife Olga de Schumacher, doctor and psychologist Leonid Stjernval, polymath and engineer Andrei Zakharov, and also another engineer on Anthony Tchaikovsky. These people are all smart, educated, contemporary professionals. And it's also important, I think, to realize that Gurdjieff reveals in his texts that he's actually well-versed in modern engineering, modern science, and that attracting people who have professional skill bases in this area is important to him. And so he combines expert pupils who are artistic and creative, dancers, composers, singers, literary figures, with expert pupils who are scientists, mathematicians, engineers, and so on, doctors especially as well. So when we think about Beelzebub, it's really interesting to come to grips with the science fiction structure. And I don't think I did until I bought a copy of David Kurdian's book On a Spaceship with Beelzebub by a grandson of Gurdjieff. And I thought, spaceship? Yeah, there is one in the book, isn't it? I went, It's very obvious, actually, that there are spaceships and planets and alien life forms and things that fit very clearly into the science fiction genre. So science fiction is the preeminent literary form of industrial modernity. It emerges in the 19th century. You'll see there an image of the cover of one of Jules Verne's novels, Journey to the Center of the Earth. He's a tremendously important figure in the establishment of science fiction as a successful entertainment genre. And it's interesting, he's building on what we would call adventure novels, which already exist, adventures that take place in real world, Earth world contexts, but he stretches the adventure novel, going into space, going under the sea, going to the center of the Earth, and providing these amazing adventures. The other thing that's really interesting is that actually he knew quite a lot about contemporary 19th century science. And the scholar of science fiction, David Steed, always says that the best sci-fi author, the ones that are really well regarded, are engaged and socially relevant and responsive to their circumstances. And of course, Verne's circumstances was the Industrial Revolution, which was happening all around Europe, transforming the way that people lived life, did things. The other reason why science fiction is important, I think, is because it's a genre that lends itself to mythic and legendary and almost scriptural forms anyway. The same argument can be made about the literary genre of fantasy, which I won't talk about much today. It has affinities with these sorts of modes because it talks about other worlds and non-human actors, and often there are questions of oppositional or at least contrasting ethical systems, cultural systems, and people get kind of excited by reading these books and thinking thought experiments. What if we were like Martians and we thought differently about the way that these sorts of things work? And of course, as well as Verne, we have another genre that comes from scripture, the genre of apocalyptic or eschatology, which enters science fiction through writers like Gurdjieff's near contemporary H.G. Wells, who wrote about time travel, but also interplanetary conflict and violence that might come from the encounters between different entities, different alien beings, shall we say. So just a small excursus into the traditional Gurdjieff. We talked a lot yesterday. It was wonderful. I'm glad that I had exposition from Roger and from Michael on the tales, because it means I don't have to do much of that today. And there was also discussion by Steve and various other people about the bardic tradition, the idea of being an ashok, a teller of tales, and Gurdjieff's respect and valorization of his father's embeddedness in traditional learning, the fact that he knew the text of the Epic of Gilgamesh before the cuneiform tablets were translated in modernity or even discovered, is put forward as a very important factor in meetings with remarkable men. He also told Catherine Mansfield, and this was mentioned too, that she was dying of tuberculosis when she arrived at the Institute, and he told her to sit on a platform above the cowshed following an old peasant remedy for tuberculosis, and she spent quite a lot of time on a divan full of cushions over the cowshed, relaxing in that location. But if you kind of don't cherry pick just small things like that, it doesn't seem that his viewpoint overall is antithetical to modernity. And I think the fact that Beelzebub is framed as science fiction, and it's a very influential book, and it was recognized as extraordinary even by critics and those who would like to dismiss it when it was published. So it's a revolutionary modern form that he chooses. He doesn't just write, say, a very traditional sounding allegorical text or a more didactic form of scripture. So, it is a complex science fiction novel. It was written between 1924 and 1931. Obviously, there was work done after 1931, but a limited edition of the first edition of Beelzebub was made available to people in 1931. It's very interesting that Gurdjieff himself identified The 1001 Nights as a book that influenced his literary outputs, particularly the text of Meetings with Remarkable Men, the idea of a narrator telling self-contained stories about different people moving through a process. Now, the Arabian Nights, The 1001 Nights, was a very popular text, and there's no doubt Gurdjieff knew it extremely well. And this idea of storytelling as a mode of ethical engagement such that the continuation of life is enhanced. Everyone knows Shahrazad was going to be killed by her husband because he had come not to believe in the fidelity of women, and she began telling him a story and so captivated him by telling this story that it became impossible for him to actually kill her. He hung on and hung on. And after 3 years of these stories, she had convinced him of her ethical excellence, as well as having given birth to 3 children with him, and he welcomed her as queen. So this idea about you tell a story that is a morally transformative narrative is something that Gurdjieff is very aware of. So we all know Beelzebub is a native of the planet Caritas. He's the storyteller, the Shahrazad figure in the text. He travels on a spaceship called Karnak with his grandson Hussein and his elderly retainer Ahun. Now, the book, you wouldn't read it as an intergalactic adventure. Those people who like sci-fi as a genre would know that. But elements of that genre are undoubtedly present in the text. And Beelzebub's stories of his interactions with the 3 brain beings of Earth. He is an alien visitant who has encounters with human beings. And of course, the purpose of the text is to embed the cosmological worldview that was sort of analytically presented in Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous in a completely different way. And also, as I think Joseph pointed out yesterday, to mark ways in which Gurdjieff's ideas had developed and altered since that very early Russian teaching period. And one of the things that's interesting is Gurdjieff's absolutely formidable vocabulary of neologisms. What they do is they force you mentally to inhabit a different kind of world. People don't talk in the same way, and you have to learn new words in order to explain new ideas. This is significance. And I've got a quote there from Joseph at the bottom of this slide. Beelzebub's tales is on these indications scripture. And as we have seen, it's been accepted as such by at least some of its readers within Gurdjieff groups. Gurdjieff himself gave it these marks. He described it as being of first importance for his pupils, and indeed for all humanity. He prepared music to be played before and after readings. That ritual setting, I think, is important too, even if he did not pursue this beyond a certain point. And although Gurdjieff did not use the term scripture of his own writings, to view them through this prism is illuminating. So I'm saying it's a novel, and Joseph's saying it's scripture, and I would say that is not an antithetical position, and that you can have a text that functions in both of those genres and modes. So the interesting thing, of course, is that reading novels is a kind of unnatural activity in a way, but of course, it's just a development of oral storytelling, which is something that people have been doing like forever. And what happens is when you listen to a story, like Shahrazad telling her husband The 1001 Nights, or you read a favorite novel over and over again, what you're doing is you invest in characters that don't actually exist, and in certain genres, in fictionally constructed worlds that come to have a certain level of reality, objective existence for the reader. and people come to value this highly. And I've just mentioned The Lord of the Rings there, partly because fantasy, as I've already said, is a genre like sci-fi, which can easily look like legend, mythology, scripture, but also because Tolkien, a devout Catholic, had an extraordinary idea about what it meant to be a writer. He talked about what he called subcreation, an activity which was analogous to the activity of God, the creativity of the Christian God in the world. He saw his humble efforts at writing novels as being a kind of imitative, virtuous practice of the same kind, if not of the same degree. So to be a creative in some ways is to imitate God. And it's something that those of us who used to work in medieval studies are very aware of. It's very clear in a lot of medieval texts. So Beelzebub's Tales is circulated originally in typed copies and read amongst groups, and Gurdjieff workshops translations and makes certain that they have the right impact on the people when they're reading them. And this is a way to become familiar with the complex language and the concepts that underlie it. And I think it's really interesting. There's just recently been a great book written about the Little Review and Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap by a scholar called Holly Baggett. And she says Anderson and Heap communicated openly about what they thought Tales was like and about. And let's not forget, they had actually published Ulysses by James Joyce, which was a modern epic based on the Odyssey. And they talked about how Beelzebub for them resembled Ulysses as well. Expository journey in which Beelzebub has the same role as Leopold Bloom, and Hussein has the role of Stephen Daedalus, the young man who is being instructed. And the interesting thing, of course, is that they also give us evidence from their letters that Gurdjieff knew Jules Verne's novels, which I think is really handy. It's only a throwaway line in Holly Baggett's book, but it's useful to know. So we have this thing, like pupils are attracted to Gurdjieff's teachings. If they're literary, it influences their literary practices. And a lot of the kind of experimental writing that they engaged in, including science fiction, was adopted to both express work ideas and also to imitate the master, because you want to be like your teacher, you want to emulate, which I think is really important. Which brings us to this amazing guy, Alfred Richard Orage, who is the facilitator of so many of these wonderful literary talents. We know that Gurdjieff wasn't too keen on people writing notes of his teaching and or publicizing it, but of course everybody kept notes from the earliest possible time, even though people did say that the training with Gurdjieff trained their memories splendidly, and perhaps they didn't need to write down quite so much. It was customary that pupils wrote down accounts. And I mean, Ouspensky's work, I think, would not have been possible without note-taking after the fact. And the fantastic notes taken by Catherine Hume and Salita Solano from the Rope Group give us a very clear idea of how recording what different pupils are doing with the master, how it works. So the interesting thing is, before it became a popular thing to publish pupil memoirs, something that didn't actually take off till the 1960s, a lot of Gurdjieff pupils published books which were not science fiction in imitation of him or accounts of their times with the master, but nevertheless were actually inflected by work ideas. And so we have the idea that we have Cecily Swanson, who's done some really interesting work on modernist autobiography. And we have John Woodson, who was part of our team last year at Harvard, who's done some really interesting literary studies on what he calls Oragian modernism, people who are influenced by Alfred Orage and who were often part of his work groups or Jean Toomer's and had kind of links with all of these people. So the interesting thing is, and I found out this originally from Anthony Blake, but I know Joseph has mentioned it in his writings as well, that an Australian pupil of Orage called John O'Hara Cosgrave, one of the reasons it's hard to find out anything about him is because he's got a nephew who has exactly the same name, who's a famous artist. And every time you try to look for him online, you get the artist's nephew, not the novelist uncle. It's kind of interesting. He published a science fiction novel called The Academy for Souls in 1931, the year that the first text of Beelzebub was finished. It's the oldest, probably earliest Gurdjieffian text that was actually published for a general audience. So what is it? Well, I have to tell you, it may be slightly disappointing to people. I often find myself working on things and then thinking, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to sell this to people. But as you see, Book Studio has reissued this novel. The edition I have is a very old one I bought online, but it has been reissued, and anybody who feels like reading it, Book Studio has a decently priced version of it. It's a conversation between a Martian, who is the Beelzebub character, and a human being who is designated the behaviorist, who is the narrator of the story. And he is therefore evidence of all of the things that are wrong with human beings and the stupidity of human beings. And basically the chapters are conversations on different topics. The frame is different in the sense that the Martian doesn't come in a spaceship. He's a spirit traveler. And he doesn't appear. He actually communicates mentally with the behaviorist, and the behaviorist is very shaken up by all of this. But the Martian says that the reason he can do all the things he can do is because he's had years of study in what humans call occult practices, but which are none other than the exercises for developing the positive potential in the organism. I learned methods of leaving my body at will and retaining consciousness while outside of it. The behaviorist is initially chippy and rude, and he doesn't want to know what the Martian has to tell him. But eventually, he says, you see the fourth line there, I don't have time to read them all, and I must move on. Now that you've broken the ice and excited my curiosity, don't fade on me. And he says, although I'd been rude to my invisible guest, his strange conversation had deeply interested me. Of course, the Martian comes to the conclusion that human beings basically haven't learned how to self-remember. They have to become the subject of their own attention. And basically, he was really depressed to come to Earth and discover how primitive they actually were. It's worth reading. Anthony Blake also drew my attention to a novel by Catherine Burdekin, who was not herself a member of one of Orage's groups, but this novel was greatly admired by him and they were friends. So it's possible, well, it's not possible, it's obvious that she is aware of work teachings. This is an amazing book, Proud Man. As you can see, the idea of the human as puppet on that very early dust jacket. She published as Marie Constantine, another woman who wanted to hide her femininity under the guise of a masculine name in order to gain greater and more appreciative audience. She's actually a marvelous, unbelievable novelist, and her novel, which is a speculative fiction alternate history about the rise of Nazism, which is called, how do we do this? Her novel about the rise of Nazism, which is called Swastika Nights, should be read by everybody. Now it's totally amazing. In Proud Man, the character, the genuine person, is not actually an alien. The genuine person comes from the future, where there has been a completely different kind of evolution that we cannot imagine. And the person lives with three different human beings whom we would consider to be on different moral and ethical levels in life, and exhibits objective consciousness, which is something that often seems pitiless and rather difficult for humans to comprehend because it doesn't have a lot to do with the more sentimental or emotional ideas that we have about relating from person to person, but actually stands completely and absolutely outside flawed human consciousness, which is a form, as we all know, within work teaching of waking sleep. So these two novels, I see The Academy for Souls and Proud Man as being quite closely related. So we get to the point where Gurdjieff's not anti-modern, I've just said. And everybody may say, oh, well, you know, you're only putting forward one kind of way of interpreting being modern. But I think another thing that's important is the number of work pupils down the generations that have actually studied and attempted to bring out connections between his cosmology and worldview and modern sciences. Now, Tom Clark mentioned this yesterday in his talk on neuroscience. Last year at Harvard, we were privileged to hear from Charlie Langmuir, who is a professor of earth sciences at that august institution, who made a most interesting presentation on the cosmology of Beelzebub's tales and what we know about the full and absolutely incredibly long and complex life cycle of our Earth, the planet that we live on. Tom Clark mentioned Christian Wersenbaker. He has written many essays originally for the work journal Parabola, exploring different ideas about science, mathematics, the mind, psychology, various other sorts of disciplines. And eventually those were reprinted, 19 of them, in a book called Man in the Cosmos, which Tom showed the cover of in his presentation, which is a really interesting little book walking you through some ways in which you can see that Gurdjieff clearly does know about science in certain ways. And of course, I have a kind of throwaway lines here, but as well as the possibility that he undertook training as an Orthodox priest, there is also the possibility, which seems more than a possibility, that he did at least 1 year of a medical degree, probably in Athens. This is most notably commented on in Catherine Hume's Undiscovered Country. She was a nurse during World War II, and her final girlfriend, Chuka, was a nursing nun before leaving the convent. And I think she talked about Gurdjieff still having his medical textbooks from his studies. And most people would say, well, she was a medical person herself, as was her partner. They'd know what a medical textbook looked like if they saw one. And if he told her that he had studied medicine and they were his textbooks, well, sometimes he did tell people stories that weren't true, but that seems like a banal private conversation in which there's really nothing to be gained from telling people something that isn't actually true. So the other thing that's important is that last point on this slide. The science fiction author Orson Scott Card, who's actually a devout Mormon, and all of his sci-fi is strongly embedded in his Mormon faith and the Mormon worldview, he says that one of the reasons he used speculative fiction as a mode to teach people is because it's got the power to make people see their own world entirely differently. Now, as a woman, say you're young and you're seeking romance, heterosexual romance, you might find your world is changed by reading Jane Austen, but it's not the same thing as actually trying to absorb a picture of different planets, different beings, different values, things that you are entirely unfamiliar with, and that when you come out of the spiral at the end, you go, but that all relates actually to the world as it is right now that I'm living, and I can suddenly see that it has changed, shifted in my view. So I think that's a very important thing. So here we are. Yesterday, Joseph suggested that movements could be understood as a form of ritual for those people who had actually lost touch with ritual within, say, the Christian church, or churches, shall we say, Orthodox and Catholic primarily, and it could be seen as a way to lead them back into a ritualized life that was richer and more interesting. That would suggest that he knows he's actually talking to post-Christian or secular people, which I think is really interesting too, because it means he must have noticed the process of secularization, which we always point out as having, started probably with the Enlightenment, then accelerated with the Industrial Revolution, and then absolutely began galloping downhill from about the 1870s. He must have picked up on it pretty damn quickly and figured out he had to know how to talk to people who didn't talk the language of traditional Christian faith anymore and didn't really understand it. And he's also presents himself as fascinated by machines and aspects of industrial modernity in Meetings with Remarkable Men. and he's adapted the sci-fi frame for Beelzebub's Tales. The interesting thing is, I don't have time to talk about the music. In fact, I really have to shut up. I'm 1 minute past my 30 minutes. But the music, which seems to us extremely beautiful and evocative, fitted in with the frame of, say, the first performance of The Rite of Spring by Stravinsky in 1913. Most people, when they first heard the Gurdjieff de Hartmann music, thought it was discordant and difficult to understand because it didn't sound like modern romantic classical modes which had created certain expectations in the cognitive architecture, that part of our brain that recognizes music. Gurdjieff's a modern, he lives in modernity, and he's creating a culture and an esoteric teacher for modern people using modern materials. And, well, my final line is it's undeniable. It doesn't matter how you read Beelzebub, it is a story about space travel and alien beings. Thank you. Very happy to answer any questions or hear any comments should you have any. Thank you.
Carole, that was very much a good case for this. And this one's about what evidence we have that Gurdjieff knew about the emergence of Ulysses, given that the first chapter of that book by Joyce was published in the little review by Margaret Anderson and Jane Heap. Can you tell us what we know, if we do know, that Gurdjieff was practically aware of this text, which I think is quite similar form of fable, although it's not a science fiction novel, but it's rooted in myth, it's rooted in Greek myth, it's rooted in, vernacular cultures.
And it requires allegorestus as a method of
Yeah.
reading, which is interesting. Look, I haven't done enough work here, but I will say that I'm currently really interested in Anderson and Heap and their Paris years. And it happened because last year I read Peter Niergo's novel, The Saint of Montparnasse, which is an obscure novel in which Gurdjieff features as a fairly major character. It's a novel about Constantin Brancusi, the Romanian sculptor, whom we know Gurdjieff was a friend of. In fact, Margaret Anderson, again, with her wonderfully gossipy letters and diary, she describes in one of them this fabulous cook-off between Gurdjieff and Brancusi, in which Gurdjieff cooks Armenian dishes and Brancusi cooks Romanian dishes, and they each have the special alcohols of their native countries, and people are eating in Brancusi's very humble Montparnasse studio in this wonderfully bright sort of atmosphere of friendship. In the novel, Niergo, who is a real person, he has a character in the novel. He calls himself something different, but he is another person who knew Gurdjieff well as knowing Brancusi from his youth. He said he presents them as oppositional. He presents Gurdjieff as critical of Brancusi's shift. Brancusi was one of what's his name? Amazing sculptor. Camille Claudel's partner. Rodin. He was Auguste Rodin's chief naturalistic carver in Rodin's atelier for many years. And when he broke with Rodin, Rodin said, "You'll be a beggar till you die, and the sort of thing you actually want to do is nothing. Why don't you just imitate my work and float on my coattails?" And Brancusi went away to make those amazing abstract sculptures of birds and eggs, which he related to his Romanian Orthodox faith, incidentally. Tremendously important stuff. He was an extremely religious man, also a mystic who had an experiential religious life. So anyway, where I'm going with the Ulysses and what Gurdjieff knows, when you get the list of the people whose exhibitions he went to and who he had cook-offs with and who he had dinner with in their houses and drinks with in bars, I think it's impossible that he didn't know about the publication of Chapter 1 of Ulysses. So I want to go down there. I mean, I know I've talked about this to Joseph briefly years ago. I've been collecting books and I still haven't got around to reading them. I want to reread Dorothy Caruso's autobiography and, books that are kind of work adjacent. People who are not totally in often have things to record, like they're often at events and they see Gurdjieff do different things with different people. And it's kind of handy to get an idea.
Brancusi, of course, fits with what you were saying earlier about Gurdjieff as a kind of collector of experts, seeking out those folks who are experts in their particular field and using them as the material to help bring out his own ideas.
I also think there is, I mean, it's not entirely instrumental on Gurdjieff's part. These people are genuinely his friends. He loves them. There's real closeness there.
Yes, I would like to say that he was aware of Ulysses because Hartmann wrote a musical composition on the last pages of Ulysses, in modern style, of course. So this avant-garde strand of music was very dear to both Hartmann and Gurdjieff. He was aware of Ulysses, all avant-garde composers, wrote music on James Joyce's, specifically Ulysses, on the different pages.
Thank you very much.
That's all.
That's helpful. We just had a comment saying that Hartmann wrote a composition on the last pages of Ulysses, and that many avant-garde composers were inspired by Joyce's text. And the fact that we can put Hartmann in that space suggests, obviously, real knowledge, direct. We can say that's a direct cause connection, not just an inference.
Dr. Cusack, you talk about these friends of Gurdjieff. Can you say any more about people who weren't students, but it almost sounds as though they're treated as peers?
This is really interesting. I hadn't thought much about this at all. That's a great question. And again, reading The Saint of Montparnasse was what got me going. Because a few years ago, a journal that I edit, Literature and Aesthetics, Basarab Niculescu got in touch with me and he said, I've been writing an article with Paul Beekman Taylor and we'd like to publish it. And we think, your journal might be like a sympathetic place. And I said, sounds interesting. What's it about? And he said, it's about Brancusi and Gurdjieff. And I thought, okay, all right. And when it came, it wasn't what I expected because a lot of it was about Niergo's novel. And it's about Paul Beekman Taylor's conviction that his mother, Edith Taylor, is the model for the heroine of the novel, Brancusi's lover. And the interesting thing, of course, is Edith Taylor is one of those women who had a relationship with Gurdjieff, but she wasn't a pupil. She really wasn't. She knew pupils and was friendly, like very friendly with Jessamine Howarth and her daughter Eve. Petey was brought up to an extent with Dushka, but she was never actually in. And it's in that novel that I got to realize, and in Beekman Taylor and Niculescu's article, that I got to realize how many of these artistic figures that Gurdjieff was acquainted with, a lot of them through Brancusi, who was apparently very popular and very well loved, an enormously hospitable and warm man despite his poverty and lack of success.